It's 2017, and Vic Amuso's the boss of the Lucchese crime family. The guy's been in jail for nearly 25 years at this point, and he's in his 80s. Plus, he's in good physical shape and has a strong mind at his age and was still considered the boss of the family, and his words were treated with absolute respect. And for nearly a decade, he had left Matty Madonna in charge as his acting boss. And Madonna was this old timer who had spent most of his life in prison, but he's respected and he came from the Bronx. But the guy continued to get in trouble, and he was facing more prison time in 2015 with a 5-year racketeering conviction. And then in 2017, he's facing life in prison for the 2013 killing of East Harlem Purple Gang leader Michael Meldish. So you go back to the 70s, the East Harlem Purple Gang, it was at its peak. And you can think of it as a farm team of sorts in Harlem, but it operated independently. And, it was a large gang. You had upwards of 50, 60 guys that was part of it. I mean, they would do pretty much anything to make a buck. Very violent, but quite a few of those guys actually ended up with one of the 5 crime families. So you had Matty Madonna from the Harlem, or I guess Harlem, Bronx, Manhattan faction. And then you had the Brooklyn side. And so on the Brooklyn side, you had Big Mike DeSantis, and Vic Amuso, the boss, knew him very well. And in fact, Mike DeSantis had done a couple of hits for Amuso back in the 80s. DeSantis, younger than Madonna, and also he was closer to Amuso, personally closer. So you had the 2 largest factions involved in petty disagreements, if you're to believe what we hear. And so in 2017, facing internal disagreements, they said that Vic Amuso undertook what was described as a bloodless coup from behind bars. And so if we look at the court testimony by turncoat soldier John Panisi, which I'm not sure if you can take it 100%. But what he said is that Amuso sent an explicit letter from prison to then underboss Stephen Correa, declaring that the current Bronx-based acting boss, Manny Madonna, was to be replaced. And also Amuso said in that letter that Big Mike DeSantis would become the new acting boss. And then the most interesting part of it, which is probably the most unbelievable, is that Amuso authorized a hit list in that letter, signaling that if the Bronx faction resisted the changes, that they've been marked for death. So instead of a mob war, they said that Stephen Correa and Manny Madonna stepped down and Mike DeSantis took his spot. And like I said, I don't know if we can believe Panisi's account on this, because Madonna was already behind bars and he had been charged with the murder of Michael Meldish. But as far as Amuso goes, how does a man who hadn't been on the street for over 25 years still command power and respect? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Little Vic Amuso, the deadly Don. Vic Amuso was born in 1934, and that's during the middle of the Great Depression. So this was not a good time for most of America. Amuso was born in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, and he grew up in a very poor family. And they said that he's the 11th of 12 kids. Little Vic was a smaller kid, but he was also athletic. And when he grew up, he ended up about 5'6" tall. So he was not a tall guy at all, pretty short. They said he liked to play handball, and so you saw him as kind of this athletic type. His older brother Bobby also became a Lucchese soldier, and he owned the Walnut Bar, which was a tavern on Flatlands Avenue. And so there's an interesting story about how future mob acting boss Al DeMarco met Little Vic Amuso. And this must have been in probably the late 50s. And so at the time, Vic Amuso was involved as this low-level guy working on a bust-out scheme at the Wallabout Market. And that was a market, a kind of a central market on Flushing Avenue in Brooklyn. And this was a place where wholesalers would receive products, from farmers, from distributors, from trucks, and it was food items, and these items would be sold to retailers, grocery stores. And anyway, there were two brothers that muscled in on a vendor at the Wallabout Market, and they took over this company. And so they started selling wholesale groceries to major supermarkets like Waldbaum's. And so, like I said, they're a middleman, and things actually started off pretty good. They would pay the suppliers on time, but after a while, the grocery stores would start ordering more and more items, and these farmers, these distributors, all of those type of people, they would send the goods, and they would allow 30 to 60 days credit. And so when what these two brothers was doing was that when they got all the money from the grocery stores, they didn't pay back the suppliers of the goods. And by the time the suppliers realized that there was a problem, the brothers left. So the company wasn't even there anymore. Anyway, what they said was that Vic Amuso wasn't even one of the masterminds of this bust out, but he was working as this low-level 20-year-old kid operating a push cart for the two brothers. And so that was like the first time that Al DiArco actually met little Vic Amuso. But, Vic just got into a lot of trouble, and he got into a lot of trouble at a young age. They said by the time he was 21 years old, he gets a 2-year sentence in Greenhaven prison. And then a few months after getting out of prison, he gets picked up again, this time on assault and robbery charges, but he beats that case. And then maybe a year later, Lil Vic tries to steal over $3,000 in checks from a Brooklyn ironworks factory. And so he has this holdup, and he's by himself, and everything he thinks is going well, but all of a sudden the factory clerk resists, and Lil Vic shoots the guy. The guy ends up living, but the police find out what happened, and Amuso gets arrested, and so he ends up pleading guilty and gets another prison term of 2.5 to 10 years. And this time he's going to be at Sing Sing prison. And then while at Sing Sing, he runs into Al DiArco again. And what we know is that Lil Vic, during this time, he becomes friends with Al DiArco, a lot of the other Italian wannabes, really from all the families. And also, he met several wise guys, and also some of the guys associated with the Pravacci family's Gallo crew. I know that we hear that Vic Amuso, after he got out of prison, did some work with the Gallo crew, but I don't have any evidence of that. I mean, he wasn't a guy that operated on President Street. He wasn't a Red Hook guy. I mean, this guy was a Canarsie guy. We know that he did some stuff up in Williamsburg, but as far as him being with the Gallo crew, I don't think that we have enough evidence to say that was true. So anyway, by the time Vic's 30 years old, he's still this low-level guy. He was still spending time in and out of prison. But by the early 1970s, he gets acquainted with this young up-and-coming associate from Brooklyn named Anthony Gaspipe Casso. Casso himself had started off in the 1950s as a member of the South Brooklyn Boys Street Gang. And eventually, Casso meets Christy Tick Fanari. And Christy Tick's the guy that run the notorious 19th Hole crew. And Christy Tick becomes somewhat of a mentor to Gaspipe Casso. Christy Tick himself, he's a huge moneymaker. He's known for being involved in illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, burglary, union rackets, and even dope. But he's not a good guy, actually a scumbag. He was a violent guy and even had convictions for the R word of an underage teenager. The Lucchese family had traditionally been out of the Manhattan, Harlem, and the Bronx, but with the likes of Paul Vario, Christy Tick, John Armento, they started building up these large crews in Brooklyn and New Jersey. And after a while, Vic joins this 19th hole crew. Understand that Vic Amuso is about 10 years older than Gaspipe Casso. But from this point on, Vic and Gas are inseparable. They become proteges for Christy Tick, and for the most part, Vic and Gas make their money from dope, which was against the rules of Cosa Nostra. However, greed always trumps rules when it came to money. In fact, both Vic and Gaspipe Casso get prison terms for drugs in the 1970s. Vic and Gas on the street, they were known for their violence, and people knew not to cross them up. I mean, both guys were small guys, but they knew how to use a gun. They were good with their hands. You didn't want to mess with them. Most importantly for Vic and Gas, what helped them was they made a lot of money for Christy Tick. Later on, within the 19th hole crew, Casso and Amuso lead a burglary crew known as the Bypass Gang. You had all these locksmiths, safe crackers, and experts in security alarm systems that was part of this gang. And authorities estimate that the Bypass Gang stole more than $100 million from safety deposit boxes and vaults across New York City and Long Island during the 1970s and 80s. And Amuso and Casso then get inducted as members of the Lucchese family by 1977. Fast forward maybe 3 years, and Christy Tick is now made the concierge of the Lucchese family. And someone needs to take over Christy Tick's 19th hole crew. Initially, he wanted to make Gaspipe the capo of the crew, but Casso didn't want it. Casso said, he would rather have Amuso take on the capo role, and Casso wanted to work directly for Christy Tick as what they called an aide de camp. Understand that within Cosa Nostra, a concierge is allowed to have one made guy working directly for him in a role that's similar to what I'd call like a chief of staff, kind of an assistant. So in the 1980s, all the five families were making boatloads of money. Every part of life was controlled by the mob in New York. Every racket, from construction to unions to the fish market to the ports to newspaper contracts and even the garment district, was controlled by the mob. At the time, the Lucchese family had about 120 made guys and several hundred associates. They were involved in construction. They were involved in the windows rackets, cart hauling, drugs, hijacking, fencing, plus traditional gambling and loan sharking rackets. And Lucchese's had always been a stable family since the 1930s, with Tommy Gagliano and then later Tommy Lucchese running the family, mostly out of Harlem and the Bronx. Now in the 1980s, you had a guy named Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo running the family. And he got his nickname because he knew how to duck indictments. The police and law enforcement would always be after him, but somehow the guy was able to avoid going to prison. And this guy, Tony Ducks, he is from the 107th Street Gang. He was a well-respected old school boss that also got along with all the other commission bosses. But things go sideways fast in 1985. Rudy Giuliani figures out how to use RICO, and Tony Duck's luck runs out. Anticipating his conviction and life sentence, Tony Ducks begins planning an orderly succession for the Lucchese family. Initially, he named his protege buddy Luongo as the acting boss in early 1986 while the trial was underway. Amuso, who had been Luongo's driver and bodyguard, viewed him as a rival for power. And then in December of 1986, Luongo disappeared. No one knew what happened to him, but whatever happened, it wasn't an accident, and it involved the mob. Rumors on the street was that Amuso and Gaspipe Casso orchestrated Luongo's murder to remove this last obstacle to power. And the truth is, with Luongo gone and Tony Ducks facing life in prison, Corallo convened a meeting at Christy Tick's home, and he formally designated one of his two-star proteges, Vic Amuso or Anthony Casso, to succeed him. Amuso and Casso mutually agree that Amuso would be the one that takes the mantle as boss, and Casso would be the chief lieutenant. So on January 13th, 1987, upon Corallo's imprisonment, Vic Amuso becomes the official boss of the Lucchese family. And Anthony Casso at the time is the concierge. Even before officially assuming command of the Lucchese family, Amuso had just demonstrated a willingness to get involved in these high-level mafia power struggles. Back in April of 1986, he and Gaspipe took part in the infamous takedown of Gambino underboss Frank DeCicco. DeCicco was killed by a car bomb in Brooklyn and was a device planned under his vehicle by a hired bomber named Herbert Pate, while Amuso, Casso, and Amuso's brother watched from the distance. The bomb was intended to kill John Gotti, who had took over as Gambino boss, but he got the reins because he took out Paul Castellano, and that murder was unauthorized. The Lucchese family was pissed, and also if you look at the Genovese family, they were pissed. So they felt that they need to do something about it, and so this was a revenge plot. Although Gotti escaped, the blast killed DeCicco. According to later testimony, Amuso and Casso had conspired with Vincent the Chin Gigante to carry out the execution, and they only succeeded in killing DeCicco by mistake. And this allegation actually came from Casso's later admissions, but it never surfaced in court because Casso had been dropped from the witness protection program before he could testify to it. But the DeCicco bombing showed Amuso's willingness to intervene in the affairs of rival families and to employ extraordinary violence. And when you look at that's like a prelude to the bloody tenure that would define Vic Amuso's reign. By 1986 and 1987, with the old bosses in prison, Amuso and Casso firmly took the helm of the Lucchese family. Amuso's coronation as boss in 1987 marked the start of what would become one of the bloodiest regimes in modern mafia history. At 52 years old, little Vic Amuso now commanded one of the New York storied five families, and he was going to rule it with an iron fist. So we're going to stop it there today because the reign of Vic Amuso would take up its own show. I know that many people are familiar with what happened once Vic and Gaspipe Casso took over the family. If you don't know, they destroyed it. There's this misconception that Gaspipe controlled Vic and that Vic himself didn't agree with the murders and all that, but that's absolutely not true. Vic was just as much involved in the murders and the plots, and he was willing to do whatever it took to keep power. I wouldn't say he was a psychopath or liar like Gaspipe Casso, but he was ruthless and you didn't want to mess with him. But the two of them did destroy the family. He wasn't a good boss, in my opinion, but he survived. He never ratted, and he can hold up his head, unlike Gaspipe Casso, who's one of the worst human beings ever and one of the worst rats as well. Anyway, I wanted everyone to see the origin story of little Vic Amuso. It's interesting to me when you see the story of a young kid growing up in poverty and how he is able to eventually become the boss. This wasn't the journey most people would have expected. Vic Amuso's still alive in prison, but I don't ever see him getting out. All of his attempts for compassionate release have been denied. There's just too much violence, too many murders. Vic Amuso's 91 years old, and he's at the Buckner Medium Federal Medical Facility. Anyway, let me know what you think about Vic Amuso's story. And do me a favor and hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless you always.